There are moments in life when just one word, one look, is enough to shake us deep inside. Not because it is too intense, but because it hits us directly in the face of what we have always feared, being looked at with judgmental eyes even though we have done nothing wrong. Imagine, you board a flight holding a first-class ticket that you paid for with your own hard-earned money. But before you can sit down, someone stands in front of you, eyes suspicious, voice cold. Are you sure you're sitting in the right seat? If it were you, which would you choose? Tolerate and let it go, or to stand up for your dignity? And where would that choice take your life and the lives of others? Today's story isn't just about a first-class seat. It's about something much deeper than that. If you are willing to walk with me through this emotional journey, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more healing yet thoughtful stories. Now then, here we go. That morning at Denver International Airport, the early morning sunlight filtered through the thick glass of the terminal, a pale yellow light that made people feel like everything could start over. But for Elias Grant, 50 CEO of a thriving technology corporation in Atlanta, the morning had a different flavor. A slight vague premonition, as if something was about to go wrong. Elias has always been a man of quiet mornings. He usually brews a cup of black coffee without sugar, reads a few pages of a book while the sunlight filters through the window of his small apartment. For him, silence is a way to steady his mind in the hustle and bustle of the world. But today he is not at home. Today is the day he has to fly to Seattle to prepare for an important meeting with the board of directors of EagleJet Airways, where he will become the new CEO in just a few months. Flight number EJ721, seat 1A, first class. It was a seat he had sat in countless times in his life, but every time he boarded the plane, Elias could not forget the feeling of both familiarity and strangeness. There was something about the confined space of the cabin that always brought back childhood memories. He remembered his father, a man who worked in an auto repair shop with rough hands but a bright mind, who had taught Elias, "You may have to work twice as hard to be seen as someone else, but don't let that make you bitter." That saying followed Elias all his life. Not as a complaint, but as a compass to keep his heart soft in the face of harshness. He boarded the plane with a small suitcase, tall and broad-shouldered, but with a gentle gaze, as if nothing could upset him. But seconds after he found seat 1A and placed his hands on the armrest, he heard a voice behind him, hard, unpleasant, and judgmental. "Excuse me, sir. What are you doing here?" That was the voice of Kelly Monroe, the flight attendant for today's flight. Elias turned back, smiling slightly. "I'm just looking for my seat." "This is first class," Kelly insisted, as if he hadn't heard. "This seat is for first-class passengers. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The air in the cabin stopped for a moment. A few curious glances turned towards them. A middle-aged man in seat 2C raised his eyebrows slightly. A young girl from the economy row raised her phone and started recording. This scene, Elias had seen it too many times in his life, to the point where he could predict every movement on Kelly's face. He held out his boarding pass. Kelly didn't look at it closely. She just said, "This doesn't look right. Do you have another one?" Elias stood there, not reacting harshly, not losing his composure. Only a faint sadness flashed in his eyes. A sadness that was hard for outsiders to see, but was ingrained in those who had once been judged by appearances. Before he could reply, a passenger whispered, "At this point she's profiling him." Then another voice. "Why does this always happen?" Kelly radioed in Captain Harris code Amber at first class. "I need you up now." The cabin was bustling. Passengers were buzzing. Kelly stood in front of Elias as if he were a threat. And the live stream, now viewed more than 3,000 times, started generating comments. "Is this discrimination? What did he do? She didn't even check the ticket properly." Elias looked at all this, then put his hands on the arms of his chair. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to face a big decision. The question echoed in his mind, should I be patient, or should I stand up this time? He knew the answer. and he knew it wasn't just for him. Just as Captain Harris entered the cabin and opened his mouth, Elias only softly said, "Before you guys make your decision, I just want to ask one thing." The whole cabin was silent. The story begins from that very moment, a small moment, but enough to shake not only a flight, but also the lives of the people on it. Elias Grant, Kelly Monroe, Captain Douglas Harris. Just 3 men, but their fates are about to collide in ways no one expected. The first-class cabin was awash in white light, illuminating everything more clearly than necessary. The light illuminated not only the tense faces but also the unspoken words. Elias stood there in the midst of luxury but filled with doubt, a feeling he had not yet gotten used to in his 50 years of life. Captain Douglas Harris entered. His neat uniform seemed to exert an invisible power that silenced everyone. He looked at Kelly, then at Elias. "What's going on here?" His voice was not loud but sharp, like the way a man with thousands of hours in the air responded to every turbulence with experience rather than emotion. Kelly spoke immediately, somewhat hurriedly, as if afraid of losing the opportunity to lead the conversation. "Captain, this passenger, he cannot present a valid ticket. I believe he is sitting in the wrong seat, and he is not cooperating." Elias kept his eyes calm. Deep inside, he felt a thin layer of disappointment, but also a little familiarity. Part of him had hoped that he had passed the stage in his life where people looked at him with suspicion just because of the color of his skin. But apparently, the wounds of society sometimes had not yet healed. He took a deep breath, not for courage but to maintain the composure he always chose. "Captain," Elias said softly, "I showed her my boarding pass. My seat is 1A. Captain Harris held out his hand. "Let me see." Elias placed the card on the captain's palm. Harris watched for a few seconds, but at that moment Kelly interjected, "Captain, the badge doesn't look right. He should be sitting in economy." A few passengers sighed softly, others looked at Kelly in confusion. The live stream gained another few thousand views. Someone's heartbeat was clearly heard in the quiet cabin. Harris nodded slowly. "Sir, do you have any identification, driver's license, ID, credit card, anything?" Elias was silent for a moment, not because he didn't have any, but because he could sense what was happening. It was a familiar cycle. When people don't believe you, they demand more proof, then more, until they find something that confirms their suspicions, or until you give up. He opened his wallet and handed over his ID. Harris examined it carefully, then looked at his boarding pass. Everything was in order, but Kelly was still standing behind him, arms crossed, voice stiff. "Captain, I told you, something is wrong. I am sure he is not a first-class customer." The words fell to the cabin floor and shattered into pieces. One of them touched Elias's heart. Elias looked at Kelly, not angrily, not hatefully, but with the look of someone who was used to these sharp assumptions. He said, "Are you sure?" Kelly was silent, her gaze still fierce, like she was trying to cling to the only thing that made her feel powerful at the moment. In the back seat, an elderly woman whispered, "Why is she so hostile? He did nothing wrong." The young man live streaming said softly, "This feels off." Elias heard, but he did not reply. In that moment a memory flooded back. His father driving the family out to dinner in his old car one summer evening when Elias was 12. When they arrived at the restaurant, the manager stood at the door saying they were closed to strangers at this hour. But then a white family walked in and was greeted with smiles. His father turned away in silence. Elias asked, "Why don't we go in?" And his father simply replied, "Sometimes you have to be silent for the sake of the family." But in his eyes was a hurt that could not be hidden. Elias returned to the present, and this time, he knew he was no longer a child bowing to his father. He was a grown man with a position, a voice, and above all, a responsibility to those who could not speak for themselves. He said, his voice low but firm, "Captain Harris, before you make your decision, I want to ask one thing." The captain looked at him, frowning slightly. Why? The whole cabin held its breath. Are you making this decision based on facts? Or on the feelings she imposed on you from the beginning, Elias said. The question wasn't big, it wasn't heavy, but it cut through the cabin like the sharp blade of truth. Harris paused. Kelly looked at Elias with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to say it so bluntly. Elias continued slowly. I don't want to cause trouble. I don't want to delay the flight either. But if I stay silent today, then tomorrow someone like me will go through the same thing. Silence fell. Livestream surpassed 1,000 viewers. Harris cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice normal. Sir, I need to follow procedure. I'll call security. We can check further underground. It will only take a few minutes. Elias looked straight into his eyes. It was not angry, not attacking, but rather made one feel examined. You want to take me off the plane? Even though the ticket is correct, the ID is correct, and I did nothing wrong just because she sees that I don't look like someone sitting in first class. Harris did not reply. Elias asked again deeper, this time more directly. If I were a white man dressed like this, looking like this, would you require security? No one breathes harder than necessary. Kelly looked away, confused. Harris stood up straighter, but his shoulders were slightly tense. As for Elias, he placed his boarding pass on seat 1A and said, I'll stand here, Captain. I'm not running away. I'm not resisting. I just want you to answer a question in your heart, not mine. Are you protecting the safety of the flight? Or are you protecting the feelings of a flight attendant who just misjudged a person? A question no one expected him to dare ask. A question that left the cabin dead silent. During the live stream, comments poured in. He's right. This is discrimination. Captain better think twice. Just when the atmosphere was at its most tense, Captain Harris's radio rang. Captain Harris, please stand by. Corporate operations is requesting immediate contact. Harris looked down at the radio, then at Elias. Confusion flashed across his face. Elias was silent, but in his heart, there was a slight wavering between hope and weariness that lasted for many years. He wondered, would things be different this time? Captain Douglas Harris's radio still vibrated in his hand. A call from corporate operations at the most tense moment was never a good sign. The first-class cabin suddenly became even quieter than before, as if every sound was trapped in layers of air so heavy that one felt as if one were about to lose one's breath. Kelly Monroe stood behind the captain, her hands clasped together. Though she tried to keep her face calm, her eyes showed concern. Part of her believed she had followed the right procedure in requesting further testing. But there was a small part of her, a part she didn't want to face, that was beginning to doubt herself. Elias Grant remained standing by seat 1A. He said nothing more. No pressing, no aggression, just silence, and that silence made Harris even more confused. There was something about Elias's calm demeanor that made it difficult to see him as a disruptive passenger. More than that, it made Harris feel scrutinized. He turned away so he wouldn't have to look into Elias's eyes that were both calm and questioning. Harris pressed a button on his radio. Captain Harris here, go ahead. There was a slight static on the other end of the line, then a firm voice spoke. Captain, we are receiving reports from passengers and social media live streams regarding an incident in first class. Remain in your positions. Do not remove passengers from the aircraft until we have verified. Harris narrowed his eyes. Livestream, is the situation that serious? Yes, Captain. We are monitoring closely, awaiting further instructions. Connection off. In the cabin, a young passenger whispered, they're watching this online. Someone's streaming it. Another responded, well, good. This airline needs to be held accountable. Kelly heard every word. Her throat was dry. Part of her wanted to explain that she didn't mean any harm, but reason told her that this wasn't the time to open her mouth. The more she said, the more likely she was to make a mistake. Captain Harris turned, looked at Elias, then at Kelly. All right, he said softly. We await further instructions. But Kelly couldn't contain her frustration, Captain. We can't leave him standing here forever. I know for sure there's something wrong with his card. I've seen many cases like this. Elias did not turn to look at her. He only said as lightly as a breath, "Have you seen many cases like mine? Or do you simply believe that all people like me are suspect cases?" The question sent Kelly reeling back with an invisible force. A few passengers gasped awkwardly. Some turned away. Some stared at Kelly waiting for an answer. But Kelly didn't answer, because she knew she couldn't. Just a minute later the intercom blared. "Security Team Bravo is approaching the first-class cabin. Please do not move." Two security officers in Navy uniform stepped forward. One was Officer Raymond Clark, the other was Officer Jenna Price. Both had a calm, professional demeanor, but as they glanced at Elias and Kelly, Elias could see clearly in their eyes. They were trying to figure out what was really going on. Clark spoke first. "We have been told that we have uncooperative passengers." "Who needs assistance here?" Kelly immediately pointed at Elias. Him. He refused to leave his chair for further examination. Officer Clark stepped closer to Elias. "Sir, we don't want to cause trouble, but according to reports you're interfering with boarding. We need you to come with us down." Elias looked at Clark unafraid without resistance. "Officer Clark, are you sure everything you heard is true? You can check my card right here. I don't have anything unusual." Clark glanced at Kelly as if to verify. Kelly was startled because in that moment she realized she was facing the truth she had been ignoring. She had never really checked Elias's boarding pass. She had just glanced at it and let her prejudices, her emotions, and her gut feeling guide her. She swallowed. "Captain, I just thought we should be careful." Elias turned to her for the first time, his eyes free of anger. "Careful or suspicious? Those are not the same thing, Kelly." Officer Clark took the boarding pass from Elias. He examined it much more closely than Kelly, and a few seconds later he exclaimed, "Valid boarding pass. Seat 1A. No signs of tampering." Kelly stiffened. Captain Harris closed his eyes for a few seconds. Officer Price looked at Kelly and asked softly, "Did you check carefully?" Kelly couldn't answer. A wave of shame rose up and constricted her chest. Elias remained calm, but inside he was a whirlwind of mixed emotions. He didn't want to embarrass others, but he also couldn't let this happen as if it were a normal thing. He thought about his father, about the times his father kept quiet because he thought silence would keep his children out of trouble. But Elias knew, if his generation remained silent, the next generation would continue to suffer. "Captain," he said, turning to Harris, "I don't want to disrupt the flight, but it's not just about tickets. It's about how people look at each other. If I leave the plane this time, it will send the wrong message." Kelly bowed her head, her hands shaking. She whispered as if talking to herself, "I just want everything to be safe." Elias said softly but deeply, "Safety does not come from blind suspicion. It comes from treating everyone fairly." Officer Clark looked at Elias, and in that moment Clark understood this man was not the type to cause trouble. He turned to Harris. "Captain, as far as I can see, there is no reason to ask passengers to leave the plane." Harris tightened his grip on his helmet, clearly struggling, not because he hated Elias, but because he was beginning to realize he had acted rashly, trusting the feelings of another officer. Elias looked at Harris through the white light of the cabin. "Captain, I respect you, and I believe you are a man strong enough to know what is right." Harris looked up. There was something in his eyes that looked like years of weariness, the weariness of someone who always thought he was doing the right thing until he was asked. Right. But for whom? He was about to say something when the walkie-talkie rang again. "Captain Harris, corporate operations needs you to respond immediately. This is urgent." Harris took a step back, trying to stay calm. "Okay, I'll go up to the cockpit and see what's going on." He turned to look at Elias, but his words were interrupted by the voice of a passenger in row 2C. "Captain, if he gets kicked off the plane without reason, I'll get off too." Another added, "So will I." An elderly woman whispered, "That man did nothing wrong." Live stream has reached 15,000 viewers. Harris watched the cabin tilt toward Elias. He took a deep breath like someone preparing to face a truth he had avoided for too long. Elias stood there, as steady as if no wind could shake him. Not because he was winning, but because he knew this wasn't the real battle. It had only just begun. Captain Douglas Harris left the first-class seats in stony silence. He walked toward the cockpit, walking a little slower than usual. Not because he was tired, but because he knew this moment would change more than he thought. The cockpit door closed behind Harris, leaving the aft cabin in an awkward silence. Elias Grant remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the edge of seat 1A. He said nothing more. No urging, no triumphant air. He understood clearly that there were battles that could only be resolved when the other side looked at themselves. Kelly Monroe stood behind her, her eyes hard. She could feel that things were getting out of control. Her initial confidence, based on her intuition and experience as a long-time flight attendant, was slowly shaking. The whispers in the cabin died down as if everyone was trying to hear what would happen next. An elderly passenger turned to the person sitting next to him. "This is going to be a storm." The other replied softly, "A storm is a storm, but perhaps it is the storm that needs to happen." In the cockpit, Captain Harris put the radio down on the control panel and tried to calm down. In his 25 years of flying, he had been through many unexpected situations. Drunk passengers, panicked passengers, technical problems, but never like this. Never before had he felt so challenged in his own values. The walkie-talkie vibrated again. Harris pressed the button. "Captain Harris here." The voice on the other end of the line was deeper and clearer this time. It was no longer the voice of a normal dispatcher. "Captain, this is Michael Anderson, Executive Vice President of EagleJet Airways." Harris swallowed. He knew that name. That rank was never called off the plane, except in the most dire of circumstances. "Yes, Mr. Anderson." "I'm Michael," interrupted. "I want you to listen very clearly. No passengers are being removed from the plane at this time, especially not Elias Grant." Tim Harris paused for a beat. "I was told there was a question about his boarding pass." My flight attendant confirmed. "We have seen the report, and we are also watching the passengers live stream right now." That sentence made Harris feel like he had been doused with cold water. Live stream. The corporate is watching live. Every action, every word is no longer in a closed cockpit. Michael's voice continued. "Captain, I need you to understand something. That man is not just a regular passenger. In 6 weeks he will be taking over as the new CEO of EagleJet Airways." Harris paused. A chill ran down his spine. What did you say?" Harris almost blurted out. "We're talking to the future leader of the company, Captain. And right now, tens of thousands of people are watching how we treat him." Harris held on to the edge of the chair. His eyes were wide with shock. Only one thought was running through his mind. "Oh God, what have I done?" Michael slowed down his voice, trying to calm them both. "I need you back in the cabin. No pressure, no pressure, no orders to deplane. Listen to him, apologize if necessary, and absolutely no coercive action." Harris's hand trembled slightly. His entire 25-year career hung in the balance between a decision. "Captain Harris," Michael added, his voice becoming more serious. "Remember that passenger, Mr. Grant will be the one who signs off on the flight crew, cabin crew policies, and even your future position." The air in the cockpit was freezing. Harris took a deep breath. "Yes, Mr. Anderson. I'll handle it." Connection off. Harris stood still for a moment, staring at the radio. Part of him was angry with himself. Part of him was ashamed not because Elias was CEO, but because he realized he had acted without checking the facts based on Kelly's one-sided story. A veteran pilot like him should have been more alert. Finally, he opened the cockpit door and returned to the cabin. When Harris re-entered first class, all eyes were on him. Kelly stood erect as if awaiting the verdict. Elias remained in his original position, his hands on the edge of his seat, his gaze so calm it made one introspect. Harris cleared his throat. The guy on the live stream immediately raised the camera higher. Harris knew the cabin was waiting for him to say something. A command, an apology, a clarification. He stood before Elias and it took him a few seconds to speak. "Sir, Elias Grant, I have contacted corporate." He paused, searching for words. "And first of all, I want to say, perhaps we were hasty." Kelly's eyes widened, her lips twitching slightly. Such an admission was rare to hear from a captain. Elias did not reply. He just looked at Harris, his eyes not angry, just silent. Harris continued, "I was asked to keep everything as it is and not take any enforcement action. Your boarding pass is completely valid." Kelly stood behind and took a slight step back, her legs trembling slightly. Harris turned to Kelly. "Kelly, we need to discuss this later." His voice was not heavy but clear, and it was that clarity that sent a chill down Kelly's spine. Elias looked at them both, his voice still soft. "Captain Harris, I don't want to be difficult for you, but I just want to make sure that people like me, passengers of color, people who don't look like what people are used to seeing in first class, are given the same respect as anyone else." Harris bowed his head. "Reading Augen Zavidi, reading Augen Zest." "I understand." Elias slowly turned to Kelly. "And you, Kelly, do you really believe you did the right thing?" Kelly bit her lip. She wanted to say, "I was just following procedure," but what she had done had nothing to do with procedure. It was emotional. It was judgmental. She had to tell the truth, though her voice was trembling. Maybe I let my emotions get in the way. I'm sorry." A simple apology, but it echoed loudly in the cabin. An older woman nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that sometimes it takes more courage to say this. Elias didn't want to push Kelly into a corner. He just nodded and replied with a thought-provoking sentence, "We all make mistakes, but not everyone dares to admit it." The atmosphere eased a bit, but the tension remained, for everyone knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Just then, the walkie-talkie on Captain Harris's belt rang again. This time the dispatcher's voice was clearer, more urgent. "Captain, corporate requires an immediate update. There is important information regarding Mr. Grant. We need your response." Harris held the walkie-talkie, his palms slightly damp. He looked at Elias as if asking permission. "Just listen," Captain Elias said softly. "I'll be here." Harris pressed the button. Captain Harris speaking. The voice from the other end of the line was straightforward. "There is an update. Mr. Grant is not just the future CEO of the airline. He was appointed this morning. And our first order of business is let Mr. Grant decide how to handle the situation in the cabin." The whole cabin was stunned. Kelly gasped. Harris stood frozen. Passengers whispered, cell phone cameras clicking as people held them up to record. Elias kept his face impassive. But there was a slight gleam in his eyes of someone who had gone too far to turn back and now knew he had to stand up for something more important than himself. Harris said in a low voice, "He decided." Elias looked down at his hands, then said, softly enough for the cabin to hear, "Looks like my work is starting earlier than expected." The cabin fell silent, and in that moment everyone understood. This was about to become more than a seat-sitting dispute. It was about to become a turning point for an entire airline, maybe an entire industry. As the radio announced its final words that Elias Grant would be the one to decide how to handle the situation, the first-class cabin seemed to be held in a vacuum. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The air seemed to split in two, half toward Elias, the other half toward the shoulders of Captain Douglas Harris and Kelly Monroe. Harris took a small step back. He was no longer in control, no longer the decision-maker. He was simply a man stunned by the consequences of his own rash judgment. Kelly put her hand to her mouth. Her face felt hot, but her hands were cold. In that moment, any excuse she had prepared vanished. As for Elias, he stood there calm, as if everything had been prearranged, even though in reality his heart was beating slowly but heavily like a hammer. Not for power, not for victory, but because he knew this moment wasn't just about him. It speaks of all the people who have stood in his shoes, those who were silent, those who suffered, those who never got the chance to ask the final question, why? Captain Harris clenched and unclenched his hands, trying to keep his composure. "Mr. Grant," he said softly, his voice as light as a breeze, I await your decision." The whole cabin turned their eyes to Elias. The phone live stream had surpassed 2,000 viewers. Elias looked up, his eyes, deep and calm as still water. He looked at Kelly first, not fiercely, not accusingly, just in a way that made the other person look at himself. "Kelly," Elias said softly. Her name rolled from his voice, soft but unavoidable. "You thought you were doing the right thing. I understand that. But sometimes faith in your gut feeling is so strong that it blinds you to the truth. I don't blame you for a moment, but I can't ignore what led to that moment." Kelly opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally, all she managed was, "I didn't realize I had gone this far." Elias nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer all along. No one notices. Favoritism is always quieter than we think. A few passengers bowed their heads as if they had just heard something too true to be easily dismissed. Elias turned to Captain Harris. Harris's eyes wavered, not because he feared losing his job, but because he was facing a truth he had never looked straight at in his 25 years as a captain. Many of his decisions don't come from process. They come from assumptions. Elias said slowly, "Captain Harris, I don't think you're a bad person. I've seen how you try to stay calm, stay professional, but there's a fine line between calm and fairness. And sometimes the most powerful people are the easiest to forget." Harris looked down at his shoes. They were well polished, but now he saw in their reflection a guilty man. "Mr. Grant," Harris turned, his voice choked. "If anything is needed, I am ready to take responsibility." That made Kelly turn to look at him with red eyes. She understood for the first time that the captain was also facing something she wasn't ready to say. The live stream continued to increase. Viewers commented, "He's so calm. Captain finally admits it. This is bigger than a seat now." Elias looked around the cabin. The man in 2C bowed his head. The elderly woman clasped her hands together in front of her chest. The young girl live streaming whispered, "I think he's gonna say something big." Elias took a step forward. Not in a hurry. Not in a showy way. He stood like a man preparing to address a council, but this time the council was made up of people watching him with eyes waiting for what they didn't yet know they needed to hear. "Guys," Elias said, his voice warm, not too loud but carrying far in the cabin, "today, I am not just a passenger. And I am not just the future CEO of this airline." He paused for a beat, just enough for everyone's heart to catch up with his. "Today I am a black man, standing before you, not asking for favors, but demanding equality." A passenger sighed emotionally. "I was that kid who went into a restaurant with my dad, only to be shooed away because they thought we didn't fit in," Elias continued. "I grew up in a world where I was taught to work twice as hard, just to be seen as normal." He looked at Kelly, then at Harris. "And today, all of that happens again. Not because the system is flawed, but because the people in that system allow judgments to take the form of habit." An eerie silence fell over the cabin. No one moved. Elias inhaled slowly. He didn't speak from a script, he spoke from the heart of someone tired of explaining his existence. "I don't want to kick anyone off this flight. I don't want anyone to lose their job. But I want and demand one thing. All eyes were on him. I want the truth to be seen. I want responsibility to be accepted, and I want change from within, not an apology from without. Harris felt his heart squeeze. As for Kelly, her tears fell silently, and Elias exhaled, as if letting go of a burden he had carried for too long. He spoke in a normal voice that held something profound. Captain Harris, Kelly, do you have anything to say? Not to me, to everyone here. Harris stepped back a little. His chest heaved. He knew this was the moment he had to choose between what was easy and what was right. I apologize, he finally said, not just for what happened today, but for not asking questions before I acted. I let my faulty intuition guide me instead of the truth. A few passengers nodded. Others looked at Harris with new respect. Elias nodded slightly as if accepting the apology. But he looked at Kelly next. Kelly stood as if her whole body was a taut wire. I apologize, Mr. Grant, she said hoarsely. I let my personal assumptions become truth in my head. I didn't check carefully. I didn't see clearly. I was wrong. Tears fell from her eyes onto her hands, but no one laughed, no one criticized. Because sometimes the truth needs to be spoken in trembling voices. Elias did not say, I forgive. Instead, he said something no one expected. Thank you for having the courage to say that. I hope from today on you will become the reason no one else has to go through what I went through. A wave of emotion spread throughout the cabin. Just then, Harris's radio vibrated again. Harris picked up. Captain Harris. The other end of the line said quickly, we just received a request from New York. The board wants Mr. Grant in the cockpit immediately. They want to talk directly. The whole cabin turned back to Elias. Harris swallowed and said, Mr. Grant, they're waiting for you. In everyone's eyes, Elias saw anticipation, not anticipation of what he would do with power, but anticipation of how he would use that power. Elias looked at Harris and nodded slightly. I will go up. But, Captain, yes, I want you to come with me, because this is not my business alone. Harris paused. Then he nodded for the first time during the flight, and he looked sincere. They walked up to the cockpit together. And the moment the door closed behind them, the cabin knew. A bigger storm was waiting on the other end of the call. The cockpit door closed behind Elias Grant and Captain Douglas Harris, with a soft but deep click marking the boundary between the confrontation in the cabin and a new and stressful chapter in the aircraft control center. The cockpit of the EJ721 was smaller than Elias had expected. The soft blue light bathed the instrument panel, and the blinking digital gauges gave the space a modern yet classic feel. Harris walked ahead, standing next to the co-pilot. Elias stood behind him, his hands clasped together like a man about to enter a conversation he knew might shape the future of aviation. The walkie-talkie connected to the center. A voice rang out, sharp and weighty. Mr. Grant, we are waiting for you. It was Michael Anderson, the executive vice president, who had called earlier. But behind his voice, Elias heard a faint noise like several people standing around the line. Elias looked at Captain Harris. Harris nodded slightly, a nod that contained both anticipation and anxiety. Elias took a step forward, his eyes calm. I'm listening, Michael. There was a brief silence, as if the people on the line were gathering their thoughts before speaking. Mr. Grant, Michael began, the situation is escalating faster than we anticipated. The cabin live stream has already surpassed 4,000 views. And we have word that several major media outlets are staging stories right at Gate E7. Elias wasn't surprised. His silence carried a quiet understanding, for he'd seen such moments played out in the media too many times, but rarely did anyone step forward to do the right thing before they exploded. Michael continued, the board, the chairman, and the entire PR team are all meeting online in the executive room. They asked him to come in and give guidance. Elias frowned slightly. Here, on the plane, that's right. Harris looked at Elias. His eyes were a mixture of respect and anticipation. as if he were wondering, what will this man do? How will he handle the power? Elias took a deep breath. I have a question before we begin. Michael replied quickly, please. Elias said, his voice low but not heavy. Has anyone on the council ever experienced what I have? Being doubted, judged, simply because they don't look like what is expected of first class. There was a long silence. The line went dead. Michael let out a small breath. I think the answer is no. Elias nodded. Good, at least we're talking on the basis of facts. Another voice spoke up, old, deep, but sharp. It was Jonathan Reeves, chairman of the board of Eagle Jet Airways. Elias, he said, we've seen the whole thing in the cabin, and I want you to know, everyone here appreciates your calm. Elias did not respond to the compliment. He simply asked, what do you want me to do? We would like your advice on what to do with Captain Harris, Flight Attendant Monroe, and the ground crew involved, Reeves said. Elias looked at Harris. Harris squared his shoulders, but his hands were shaking. Not because he was afraid of being fired, but because he knew he was wrong. And Elias saw it. Saw the truth in the eyes of a man struggling between honor and duty. Elias turned back to the radio. I will make a decision, he said softly. But not based on fear, but on hope. There was a low murmur on the other end of the line. Hope. In a crisis, no one expected that. Elias continued, his voice slow but clear. No one in the cabin is the enemy. Not Captain Harris. Not Kelly. The problem is not malice. It is habit. And habit needs to be corrected, not punished. Harris bowed his head. The words clearly went straight to his heart. Jonathan Reeves said, are you suggesting no discipline? Elias replied, no. I propose responsibility coupled with the opportunity to make amends. Harris could be the first example of a new program where leaders and employees can learn from scratch about cabin fairness, he continued. Not through scripted training, but through real-life experiences. Michael was a little surprised. You want to start on this flight? Elias smiled. That's right. And what I need now is cooperation. There was a murmur from the council. Someone whispered through the microphone, he's changing the entire crisis into a lesson that's unprecedented. Elias looked at Harris, then said, but first I want to ask Captain Harris how he feels. Harris raised his head, his eyes filled with gratitude and regret. Mr. Grant, Harris said, his voice sincere, I have flown tens of tons of airplanes in stormy skies, but I have never faced a storm that came from within myself. He paused. I was wrong. Not because of the process, but because I didn't ask more questions, didn't look back. If I had the chance, I would want to fix it. Elias listened, as someone willing to give a chance, but also willing to see the deepest part of the person across from him. That's why I believe he and Kelly need to be retained, he told the board. Not to continue as is, but to be the first ones to stand up and say to the entire team, I made a mistake and I learned from it. There was silence on the other side of the line, but not the silence of tension. It was the silence of people in deep thought. Jonathan Reeves spoke up, a little emotional. Elias, you want to lead this company in a way we've never seen. Elias replied, I don't want the brand to be beautiful only in advertising. I want it to be beautiful in every little interaction between the people here and the passengers sitting in the seats. He paused. And if you want real change, it has to start now. Harris looked at Elias with respect. What do you want me to do? We will go down to the cabin together, said Elias. And you will tell everyone what you have just told me. Harris took a deep breath. In front of the passengers, and on camera, Elias nodded. Because change doesn't come from behind closed doors, it comes from honesty. Harris thought for a few seconds, then nodded vigorously. I will. Elias put his hand on Harris's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but to a man accustomed to the rigors of flying, it was a sign of trust. Thank you, Captain, Harris replied in a low voice, his chest heaving with determination. No, thank you for giving me the chance. Elias turned to the radio and said to the council, "We will go down to the cabin, and then I will give the next step." Jonathan Reeves replied, "We trust your decision. The radio is off." Harris opened the cockpit door. The cabin light fell on them, warm but also expectant. Elias stepped forward, Harris followed, and the moment they reappeared, the whole cabin turned its eyes to the two of them. The girl live streaming had a slight shake of her hand. The elderly passenger put her hand on her chest. Kelly stood on the right, tears still streaming down her cheeks. The air was so tense that even a breath was enough to break it. Elias looked at everyone, then spoke slowly, but loudly like a bell. "We start over with the truth." The whole cabin was silent. The storm has reached its center, and that very eye of the storm will change everything. When Elias Grant and Captain Douglas Harris returned to the cabin, the air was thick. No more whispers, no more gasps. Just silence, a waiting silence, as if someone had put their hand on the surface of a lake and was about to break the first ripple. Elias stood in front, not raising his voice, not showing any sign of authority. But there was something in his eyes that made everyone sit up straighter, as if before a crucial moment that everyone could sense, even if no one said it out loud. Captain Harris stood next to Elias, their hands clasped together, and for the first time in his 25 years as a captain, he felt his heart pounding. Not because of a technical problem, but because of a problem within himself. Kelly Monroe stood near the back galley, her eyelids still swollen. She tried to keep her shoulders from shaking, but anyone looking at her could see she was burdened with something bigger than her mistake, the fear that she couldn't undo it. A passenger whispered, "Shh, they've started." Elias took a light step forward. The cabin light illuminated his face, making it soft and sharp as a knife blade. He looked at everyone. He didn't force them to look back. But the cabin did look back, naturally, expectantly. "Thank you, everyone," Elias began, his voice strangely calm. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And more importantly, thank you for listening." A pause, a sigh from row 3A, a small intake of breath from the girl live streaming in the row behind. Elias continued, "What happened today was no small matter. It wasn't about tickets, it wasn't about seats, and it wasn't just about me." He glanced at Kelly as light as a breeze. "This is about how we look at each other, and how we sometimes don't look deeply enough." Kelly bowed his head. Harris took a deep breath, as if he had just encountered something he had been avoiding. Elias continued, "I spoke to the board, and they asked me to make a decision on how to proceed with this flight." A man whispered, "He's handling this like a leader." Elias did not smile, but his eyes grew warmer. "I chose not to punish anyone in the heat of the moment, because if change begins with fear, it will not last." The whole cabin was silent. Elias turned to Captain Harris. "Captain, do you have anything to say to the passengers?" Harris straightened up, but his voice was softer than ever. "I apologize," he said, enunciating each word slowly to make sure nothing was missed. "I apologize to Mr. Grant. I apologize to all the passengers. I acted before I learned the truth. I let my prejudices rule my judgment." One of the passengers let out a soft sigh, as if they had just seen something they did not believe they would see. Harris continued, "I have flown thousands of hours in the thickest clouds, but today, for the first time in my career, I realize that sometimes the storm is not outside the window, it is inside us." The livestream guy whispered, "Damn, that hit deep." Elias nodded slightly, then turned to Kelly. She stood there, her hands clasped together. Elias did not push her, but she knew it was time to face herself. "Mr. Grant," she said hoarsely, "and everyone in the cabin, I'm sorry. I wasn't looking clearly. I let my feelings get the best of me. And that wasn't just wrong, it was hurtful." Her voice trembled, but no one laughed, no one looked contemptuous. An elderly woman placed her hand over her heart. The girl live streaming lowered her phone as if to respect the moment. Elias looked at Kelly, his eyes unflinching. "Kelly," Elias said, "I appreciate your apology. Not because it minimizes what happened, but because you had the courage to say it in front of people who might judge you." Kelly nodded, eyes wet. Elias continued, "But an apology is just the first step. Real change begins with each person's choice." He returned to the cabin. "Today you saw a mistake, but you also saw an admission of error, truth, and a desire to make things right." He inhaled. "That's what I want to build for EagleJet Airways." A passenger asked softly, "So, what do you want to do next?" Elias looked around the cabin, his eyes deep, slow, and peaceful. "I want to start with a conversation, right here, right now." A small murmur spread. Elias explains, "I want to hear, not people's feelings about this incident, but people's real experiences." He pointed to the economy cabin, people who have felt judged because of the way they look, because of the color of their skin, because of the voice they speak, because of the clothes they wear, or because of the first impression others give them. A middle-aged woman from the economy row slowly raised her hand. Elias nodded, inviting her to speak. "My son," she said, her voice breaking, "was detained at the airport last year because he was wearing a hoodie and carrying a gaming computer. They thought he was a hacker. He was only 16. He cried all night. A few people bowed their heads." Kelly covered her mouth with her hand. A man in seat 3C said, "I was once asked to give up my first-class seat just because they thought I didn't look like a businessman. I was a veteran. That decision hurt more than my injury." Elias listened, not interrupting. Harris stood still, his face red. For the first time he could hear the voices of the people he had passed in the cabin. A young man raised his hand and said, from behind, "I was live streaming, but I'm not recording anymore. I just want to say, thank you, Mr. Grant, for standing up. I want to be brave like you." Elias smiled slightly, and a warmth spread throughout the cabin. He said, "Thank you, everyone. What you share is the truth that we often sweep under the carpet. But if we want change, we have to dare to look at it." Elias turned to Harris and Kelly. "Today we begin a new journey. Not a flight from Denver to Seattle, but the journey of an airline that wants to be kinder." Harris nodded vigorously. Kelly wiped away tears. Elias said the last sentence, "As an affirmation, I don't want us to be the best airline in the world. I want us to be the fairest airline." The cabin erupted in applause, not because of the drama, but because they had just witnessed a leader choose kindness over power. The girl live streaming burst into tears. The man 2C put his hand on his heart. Harris let out a long breath as if he had been released from what he feared facing. And Elias. He stood there, peaceful, not proud, not excited, just still. Because he knew the storm had passed. Now it was time to start building something new. And the cabin warmed up, literally, in a moment of human discovery and truth. The applause in the cabin gradually died down, leaving behind a rare warmth in the air on a mid-air flight. But Elias Grant knew very well. This was only a temporary peace. Because on the ground an undercurrent was rising by the minute. No one in the cabin saw the scene outside. Denver International Airport news agencies setting up cameras, the airline's PR team running errands, and internal messages flashing across the operator's screens. Livestream hits 800,000 viewers. Hashtag number EagleJet incident tops 3. 2 federal lawmakers tweeting for an investigation. Elias understands this well. One incident of discrimination, no matter how small, in the age of live streaming, can become a storm powerful enough to shake up an entire corporation. As the applause died down, Captain Douglas Harris returned to the cockpit to check the systems. He needed to make sure the flight was still on schedule, but really, he was there to catch his breath. Kelly Monroe stood huddled at the back of the cabin, her hands clasped together as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. Even though Elias said he wanted to give them a chance, another fear still lurked in her heart. Everyone can talk about opportunities, But will people forgive me? The light fell on her face, reflecting off her red eyes, and just then a passenger approached. It was Helen Miller, 62, with silver hair and eyes that were subtle but not so sharp as to be frightening. She touched Kelly's hand lightly. "Girl," Helen said gently, "breathe. Sometimes the worst things open up opportunities for us to become better versions of ourselves." Kelly looked up, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know if I can do it." Helen smiled. "You can do it. Everyone has their first time knowing they are wrong, but not everyone has the courage to fix it. You have already started." Kelly covered her mouth, tears falling softly, not from pain but because someone was willing to see her as a person, not a mistake. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Elias was checking messages from the legal team. Michael Anderson sent Elias, "We need you to set up a meeting with the FAA as soon as the plane lands. They want you to confirm everything." Another message from the PR department, "We need to know if you want to make a statement immediately or wait until a press conference." And then a message from Jonathan Reeves, chairman of the board. "The board wants to hear your recommendations for long-term strategy. This is not just an incident. This will be a turning point for the company." Elias closed his eyes for a second. All these demands were like doors opening at once, each leading to choices that could change an industry. But Elias was used to pressure. He had lived with it for years, and this time the pressure did not frighten him. It only made him calmer. He put down his phone, walked to the space between the two cabins, and gently tapped on the handrail. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias said, "I have one more thing to share." The whole cabin was silent. What happened today is not just an accident. It is proof that our system, the aviation industry, still has dark corners that we dare not look directly at. A man in the back seat nodded vigorously. The livestream girl picked up the phone again. Elias continued, "At EagleJet headquarters, I proposed a multi-year program to change the way we value customers. But it was always delayed. By cost, by time, by fear of public opinion," a passenger whispered. He spoke as if he had been waiting for this day for a long time. Elias did not deny. "Today," he said slowly, "that day has come." Just then the intercom in Elias's pocket rang. He opened it. It was Jonathan Reeves. Voice: "Elias, here's some news. 3 competing airlines have issued statements expressing deep concern about today's incident. It seems they want to use this to put pressure on EagleJet." Elias pondered. Reeves continued, "We need you to deliver a strong message, one that doesn't just put out fires but puts us in a position to lead." Elias looked around the cabin, at the faces that were tense, hopeful, hurt, and full of anticipation. "Jonathan," Elias said softly but firmly, "I have what you need." There was a pause. Maybe Reeves was holding his breath. Elias spoke, "I'm going to announce a new program, a new set of standards for the entire airline, an initiative the likes of which the industry has never seen before." "What do you mean?" asked Jonathan. Elias replied in a deep, steady voice, "I would implement the Equity Flight Protocol. It includes mandatory cameras in first-class cabins and check-in areas, mandatory unconscious bias training for all crew, quarterly public reporting of unfair treatment complaints, and crucially the right of passengers to request a camera review in the event of a dispute." Jonathan almost exclaimed. "Elias, this is going to shake the industry." Elias said calmly, "It's time someone did the right thing." Jonathan took a deep breath, then said, "The council will meet shortly, but I believe the answer will be yes." Elias smiled slightly and turned off the radio. When he returned to the cabin, everyone looked at him as if they knew he was about to do something bigger than they thought. A passenger asked, "Mr. Grant, who are you talking to?" Elias replied softly, "With those waiting for us underground." The girl live-streamed and asked, "What are you going to announce?" Elias looked up, his gaze warm, but beneath that warmth was a very real fire. "I'm about to change the way the airline industry sees passengers, Not in handbooks, not in advertising, but in real moments. The whispers grew louder than before. A man asked Elias, "Are you sure? This is a big battle." Elias nodded. "I've been flying for too long to forget one thing. The sky is a place where people must trust each other. If we do not start with fairness, then everything else is meaningless." Just as the cabin was quiet, Harris walked out of the cockpit, his voice a little urgent. "Mr. Grant, you should know this." Elias stepped forward. "We're getting a signal from the ground," Harris said. "There are about 10 media vans waiting for us when we land in Seattle. The FAA has also sent a request to meet you as soon as you land." A silence spread like waves from one end of the cabin to the other. Elias asked, "Are you worried, Harris?" The captain answered honestly, "I worry about you." Elias touched him lightly on the shoulder. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I've faced worse skies than this." Elias returned to the cabin again, then said, "When this flight lands, a lot of things will change. But before we go on, I want to thank everyone." He bowed his head slightly, an act of humility so humble that it moved the cabin. "Thank you for sharing the truth. Thank you for seeing, and thank you for believing." He looked up. "I can't change the past, but I can change what happens from this day forward." The cabin was silent, so silent you could hear each person's heart beating in their chest. A passenger whispered, "He's not just saving the airline, he's trying to save an industry." The livestream girl nodded vigorously, her eyes red, "And maybe he will." Harris returned to the cockpit. Kelly straightened up like a man finding light in the darkness, and Elias, he walked the length of the cabin, each step determined. The sky outside faded as the plane entered light cloud, and in that moment everyone on the flight understood. They were witnessing the beginning of something bigger, not just a story, but a promise called justice. The clouds were as thin as the folds of a white sheet and drifted by outside the window. The late afternoon sunlight cast a pale yellow light on Elias Grant's face, calm and strangely peaceful, but his heart was not at peace at all. "Because I know things are starting to move." No one spoke for a moment. The cabin was as silent as a church late at night. Only the steady hum of the plane's engines could be heard, the throbbing of a giant metal beast carrying hundreds of souls through the sky. Elias stood in the aisle, with his shoulders slumped slightly, not because he was tired, but because he was listening, feeling the emotion flowing through the cabin like a long suppressed stream. He placed his hands on the back of a nearby chair, staring deeply into an invisible point ahead, not to avoid it but to prepare, because he felt it very clearly. The next moment would be the moment of no return. In the row near the back of the first-class cabin, the live streamer, Lydia Carter, was looking at Elias with a completely different gaze. No more drama-inducing excitement, no more eagerness to get views. Instead, there was a feeling of respect mixed with confusion. She whispered into live, "He was not like I expected. He did not punish anyone, did not exaggerate, did not get angry. He just chose the best way to let people see the real problem." Tens of thousands of viewers immediately commented, "He's a real leader. The way he handled it was amazing. I've never seen a CEO do that." Lydia looked at the screen, her lips pursed. For the first time in her live streaming career, she felt like she wasn't the center of attention. The story was, and she accepted that. In front of the cabin, an elderly man folded up the newspaper he had brought with him. On the front page was an article about social polarization, about misunderstandings between communities. He looked at Elias and whispered, "Maybe this is what this country needs." No one heard, but Elias seemed to sense it. He returned to the cabin, speaking clearly, "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight will not end with a landing. It will end with a message." Everyone held their breath. Elias inhaled slowly. "And I want that message to be for all of us." Suddenly, the walkie-talkie in his pocket rang again. Elias recognized Michael Anderson's voice full of tension. "Elias, the media is saying that you will fire the entire crew when the plane lands. We need you to verify the information." Elias closed his eyes for a second. "I never said I would fire anyone," Elias replied. "I just said change starts with choices." Michael gasped. "However, public opinion is demanding blood. Many people want to see severe punishment. They say if the company does not deal with it severely, then we are not really serious." Elias calmly replied, "Michael, sometimes punishment is not the way to change. Sometimes dialogue is what people fear most." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Michael said slowly, "I understand, and I believe you." Elias turned off the radio. "Editor." He stepped forward and gestured to the passengers. Silence fell. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are about to do something no airline has ever done." Kelly Monroe looked up. Captain Harris looked through the cockpit window as if he were witnessing the inauguration of a new culture. Elias raised his hand and pointed lightly at his chest. "I'm going to tell you a story. A true story. My own story." The whole cabin seemed to tilt toward him. "I am a black man. I am the one who once walked into a luxury hotel and was mistaken for a bellboy." Elias paused for a beat. "I was once asked to show my ID when entering a meeting room that I was chairing." A gasp came from row 3A. "I was once asked to change seats on a plane because they thought there was no way I could get a first-class ticket." Kelly clenched his hands into his work apron. Harris bowed his head deeper. Elias continued, "I tried to forget about it. I told myself that I was stronger than that I was successful, so I shouldn't let it hurt me." He looked at his hands, as if looking at his own life. "But I was wrong. I'm not as strong as I thought." A young woman put her hand to her mouth, unable to believe this was coming from a CEO. Elias said, "And then one day, I realized that the hurt doesn't go away. It just subsides. It's waiting to be named." The cabin was so quiet that only the slight hum of the air conditioner could be heard. Today, Elias said, "I named it. And I want all of us, whether employees, passengers, or leaders, to name what we often keep silent." He looked at each person one by one. Prejudice, judgment, and the darkness between us. His words fell into the cabin like the first raindrops of the season, slow light but touching the depths of each person's heart. Then Elias turned to Kelly. "Kelly, do you have anything to say?" Kelly stood up. This time she didn't tremble. "Yes," she said softly. "I want to tell the truth." A man turns his phone around to record. Kelly inhaled. "Today I looked at Mr. Grant and I didn't see him. I only saw an image I've grown accustomed to believing in, an image ingrained in me from things I never recognized." Elias did not interrupt. He let her speak. "But now, I want to fix that. Not because I'm afraid of being punished, not because I'm afraid of losing my job, but because I don't want to be someone my daughter is ashamed of." Her voice broke at the end of the sentence. The whole cabin seemed to compress. A woman put her hand on Kelly's shoulder and said, "You've been brave enough." Elias smiled softly, a smile that made the whole cabin quiet. But just as the cabin was immersed in that emotion, a ding sounded from the aircraft system. Harris opened the cockpit door. "Mr. Grant, we have a problem. Cabin vibration." Elias walked quickly to. "What's the matter?" Harris brought up the radar screen. "Seattle Air Traffic Control has requested a temporary diversion. There is a communications breakdown at the airport. A group of reporters and protesters have invaded the arrivals area." The whole cabin was in an uproar. Elias frowned. "Protest. Because of this," Harris nodded. "They said they wanted to see you. They wanted you to answer directly." Lydia Carter whispered, "Oh my God, this is big." Elias looked at the radar screen a little longer. Then he said softly, "Okay, then we'll meet them." "Are you sure?" "You don't need to go into that crowd," Harris said worriedly. Elias put his hand on Harris's shoulder. "Harris, if I was afraid to face the truth, I wouldn't be standing here." The cabin was filled with a mixture of emotions: fear, admiration, and hope. Elias returned to the cabin speaking clearly. "When this plane lands, I will get off first. I will talk. I will answer." He paused for a beat, a perfect pause. "Because if I want to change, I have to stand where people can see me." The cabin erupted in applause, but not loud, not wild. It was an applause of conviction. The sky outside was turning purple. The plane descended, shuddering as it passed through the thicker air, and Elias closed his eyes for a brief second. Not to run away, but to prepare to step into the storm he had chosen. The plane began to descend. The engine noise became low and lingering, like the breathing of someone preparing to enter a situation they knew would be difficult, but still had to see it through. Elias Grant stood near the cockpit door, his eyes on the purple sky ahead. Seattle was coming into view, its lights twinkling like broken stars on the ground. There was silence in the cabin. No more whispers, no more excited chatter. Just a silence, as if 100 people were holding their breath, not because they were afraid, but because they knew they were approaching a very big moment. Captain Douglas Harris opened the cockpit door slightly and looked at Elias. "Mr. Grant," he said, his voice lower than usual, "control is requesting our approach from the alternate runway. They say the main area is too crowded and potentially dangerous." Elias asked, "Is the news accurate?" Harris nodded. "The company confirmed it. There are protesters for you. There are also protesters against the company because of the incident. The press, you know. They are rushing in like a swarm of bees." Elias took a slow breath, not out of exhaustion, but as if to bring his heart back into rhythm. "Okay," said Elias. "Thank you, Douglas." Harris did not leave immediately. He stood there looking at Elias as if he wanted to say something more. Finally he said, "Elias, I want you to know, whatever happens when you land, I'm on your side." Elias smiled slightly. "I know, and thank you for that." Harris nodded slightly, then returned to the cockpit. In the middle of the cabin, Kelly Monroe stood still, her hands gripping the edge of her seat to steady herself as the plane shuddered as it descended. Lydia Carter turned off the live stream so as not to interrupt the moment. A passenger whispered to Kelly, "Are you okay?" Kelly inhaled, "I think. I'm preparing for what's coming." The passenger nodded. "No one is born perfect, but everyone can choose to be kinder. You have chosen." Kelly smiled slightly, a shaky but genuine smile. Elias walked to the center aisle of the cabin. He stopped, placing his hands on the back of the nearest chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began before we touched down, "I want to say something." All eyes were on him. "There are a lot of people out there waiting for me. Some want explanations, some want the truth, some want change." He paused for a beat. "Someone also wants a head." Some passengers shuddered. Elias continued, "I can't choose how they look at me, but I can choose how I get off that plane." He inhaled, softly but deeply. "And I will step down, not as someone who has been wronged, not as a victim, but as a leader who understands that his greatest responsibility is to stand for what is right." A woman gently wiped the corner of her eyes. An old man put his hand on his heart. No one said a word, but their faces said it all. Suddenly, the captain's voice rang out over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harris. We will be landing in 3 minutes. Please fasten your seat belts." The ding sound shook the cabin slightly. Not because the plane was shaking, but because everyone knew those 3 minutes would lead them to something they would never forget. "Elias Quay," sang Kelly. "Are you okay?" Kelly nodded, though her voice trembled. "Yes, Mr. Grant. But I'm scared." "It's okay to be afraid," Elias said gently. "Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is standing tall when you're afraid." The words made Kelly choke. She nodded harder. The plane continued to descend. The cabin lights turned a soft yellow, reflecting off everyone's faces. The port side window showed the waters of Puget Sound, the purple sunset like a painting slowly closing. Elias looked down at the scene and said softly, "The sky is always most beautiful, right before we hit the ground. No one knows whether you are speaking for others or for yourself." As the plane hit the runway, the first slight jolt caused the cabin to tilt. Some people clutched the handrails. A man breathed a sigh of relief. A little girl in the back cabin whispered, "Mom, is he gonna be okay?" The mother replied, "Baby, I think he's going to be more than okay." The plane slowed down its wheels, scraping hard against the pavement. Then it slowed down and stopped. No one unbuckled their seatbelts. No one stood up. Everyone looked ahead where Elias stood, as if preparing to go on stage. Another flight attendant ran up and whispered, "Mr. Grant, the media has surrounded the side entrance. They want you to go through the main entrance." Elias asked again, "Which way do they want me to go?" The flight attendant swallowed. "They want you to go through the camera aisle." Elias nodded. "I'll go that way." Captain Harris opened the cockpit door and stepped out, standing next to Elias. "Elias," he said softly, "I don't know how they'll react when you come out. It might be good, it might be bad." Elias looked at him, his eyes quiet but very warm. "Douglas, I'm used to the world not seeing me the way I want, but it's not what they think, it's what I do." Harris nodded. He did not hide his admiration. The speaker system blared, "Ladies and gentlemen, the plane doors will be opening in a moment." The cabin tightened in a beat. Elias turned back one last time, looking at all the passengers. Every gaze turned to him. Trust, worry, hope, gratitude. Elias said, "As I walk out these doors, I want everyone to remember one thing. What happened today was not about me. It was a voice for everyone who has ever been wronged. It was the first step toward something better." He put his hand on his chest. "I'm just the one who named it." The cabin fell silent like a theater just before the opening of a big play. Elias turned back to the plane door. There was a loud mechanical click, the sound of a door about to open onto the outside world. The girl live stream whispered, "Oh God, it's time." White light from the tube began to pour in. The noise of the crowd outside echoed like ocean waves in his ears. Elias took a deep breath. Then the plane door opened. And in that moment, the moment the light flooded in, the voices flooded in, the cameras focused, Elias Grant stepped forward. No bow, no avoidance, no fear. He stepped down as a leader ready to face the truth. The moment when the sky and the ground officially touch. The light from outside flooded in as the plane door opened, shining directly on Elias Grant's face like a stage light suddenly turned on. But this was no stage for actors. This was where the real world awaited him. The noise outside was no longer a murmur. It was the sound of waves, shout-outs, calling his name, the continuous click of cameras like hail against the glass of the telescope. Elias stood still for a moment, as if to let his feet touch the waiting ground. He walked down the first steps where nearly 40 reporters jostled to get their microphones in front of him. "Mr. Grant, can you confirm? Are you being discriminated against? Are you planning to lay off your crew? Is EagleJet in crisis?" The questions crashed into each other, crashing against rocks. But Elias was undaunted. With SET did, with Endivision, with Didivision, with Endivision. He didn't answer right away. He just walked slowly, deliberately toward the makeshift press area the airline had set up. A small podium, 2 microphones mounted on a black metal frame, an EagleJet logo on the back. The camera followed him, its bright light reflecting off the floor of the tube, making his footsteps leave a long shadow behind him, a shadow that was no longer simply his, but the shadow of millions of people who had been wronged, misunderstood, and this time they had someone to speak for them. As Elias placed his hand on the edge of the microphone stand, the crowd fell silent. There was only the sound of the television helicopter hovering overhead, the wind rushing through the boom, and the gasps of each person breathing. He looked over the crowd of reporters, then glanced at the group of passengers who had just disembarked, including Lydia Carter, the live streamer. She stopped in a corner, camera in hand, but her eyes were on Elias, as if she didn't want to miss a single detail. "Before I speak," Elias began, his voice low and calm, "I want to remind everyone that today is not the day I seek attention. I just want to go home." The crowd tightened. "But there are moments," Elias continued, "when even if we don't choose it, we must step into it. Because if we remain silent, the wrong will continue to exist." A reporter interjected, "Do you claim to be a victim of discrimination?" Elias looked at the man for a second, no harsh reaction, no avoidance. "I claim I am a victim of prejudice," Elias replied, "and the danger is that prejudice is not always obvious. It is not loud, it is not violent, it is just a look, a judgment, a thoughtless question." A ripple of murmuring spread. Several reporters bent down to take notes. A few in the back raised their hands to their mouths as if Elias's words had struck a chord with them. A female reporter asked, "Are you calling for disciplinary action against Flight Attendant Kelly Monroe and Captain Douglas Harris?" Elias looked straight into the camera before him. At that moment he knew his answer would be broadcast nationwide. "No," Elias said clearly. "I am not asking for anyone to be disciplined." The crowd froze. The dozens of microphones stopped vibrating. "Why?" a reporter asked quickly. Elias replied, "Because I don't want change to come from fear. I want it to come from realization, from truth." He paused for a beat, a perfect pause. Harris admitted his mistake. Kelly faced it. "That's something a lot of adults don't do." The crowd murmured again. Some nodded. Some frowned, for they expected a heavy sentence. But Elias was not shaken. "I don't want to take away their careers. I want them to be part of the change." Then he said something no one expected. "They will work with me to create the Equity Flight Protocol, EagleJet's new set of standards to ensure every passenger, regardless of color, gender, or appearance, is treated fairly." A reporter whispered, "My God, he's rewriting the rules of aviation." At the back of the crowd, Kelly Monroe stood silently. She had no idea the airline had allowed her to be there. She just stood by the passenger's side, her hands clasped together. But when she heard Elias say that, her eyes immediately became wet. Not because of relief, but because of disbelief that someone would choose to believe me, even when I was wrong. A reporter raised his hand. "Mr. Grant, don't you think you're being too lenient? Discriminatory incidents need to be dealt with seriously." Elias did not dodge. He looked straight at him. "Forgiveness is not weakness." His voice was low, strong, but not harsh. "Forgiveness is the hardest choice when you have the power to punish." The whole group of reporters suddenly held their breath. "And I chose the hard path. Because I was once a young black man standing in front of a door that no one opened for me. I know what it feels like to be misunderstood, and I didn't want those two to be the versions of themselves that people labeled them forever." The atmosphere fell into a deep emotional rhythm. Suddenly an elderly reporter stood up. "Mr. Grant," he said, "if what you say is true, you have just turned a moment of injustice into a program of national reform. But I want to ask, why did you do it? Because you are CEO, because you have a responsibility, or because of something else?" Elias was silent for a long moment. The wind from the runway caught his coat, making it flutter like a flag. Finally he said, "I do this because I wished someone would stand up for me." Many people's chests sank. A few reporters bowed their heads. Elias continued, "When I was young I had no voice. I had no power, and no one to protect me. A long silence. I have a voice now. I have power. And I will use it properly." In that moment a hand suddenly grabbed the microphone. Lydia Carter. She stood right next to the podium, raised the camera, but her voice was trembling. "Mr. Grant, I live-streamed everything. Hundreds of thousands of people are watching you." Elias nodded slightly. Lydia inhaled. And I just want to say thank you, not because you're the CEO, but because you're the first person I've seen who doesn't abandon those who have done wrong." There was a few claps from the crowd, sporadic but genuine. Elias looks into Lydia's camera. "Thank you, Lydia. We all deserve to be seen, even when we're not perfect." Her camera shook because her hands were shaking. A soft ding came from the walkie-talkie Elias carried. It was Jonathan Reeves, chairman of the board. "Elias, the FAA is watching your speech. So is Congress. You just changed the entire direction of the airline." Elias replied softly. "No, Jonathan. We're just getting started." He turned back to the crowd and spoke clearly. "Today, I did not come here for revenge. I came to lead the way." Then Elias bowed his head very slightly, very briefly, but enough to show respect to all those waiting for his answer, and the crowd burst into applause. Not applause for a CEO, but it is applause for a man who dared to stand in the most difficult place to say the most correct thing. The applause from the crowd had not yet died down when Elias Grant took a step back from the podium. He could feel the chill of the Seattle runway lingering beneath his feet, mixed with the faint smell of jet fuel, the smell that frequent flyers always recognize but few notice. The lights of dozens of cameras were still focused on him, turning the airport into an unexpected grand stage. But for Elias, the hardest part was over. Not the boos, not the questions, not the media scrutiny. The hardest thing is facing your own truth. And you just did it in front of the whole world. Elias turned and saw Kelly Monroe standing in the crowd of airline employees pushing toward security. She didn't dare approach the podium, but her eyes, those eyes said more than words could say. The eyes of someone who has just been given a second chance. Michael Anderson, executive vice president, walked quickly up to Elias. "Elias," he whispered, his breath coming in short gasps from having just made his way through the crowd of reporters. "The board is in an emergency meeting and wants you in the conference room immediately." Elias replied gently, "I have one more thing to do first." Michael frowned. What could be more important than this moment? Elias looked at the crowd of passengers who had witnessed the whole story from inside the plane. Surname. Michael was silent. And then he understood. Elias walked out of the press conference area and straight toward the group of passengers who had just disembarked the plane. There was no jostling, no pushing. Everyone stood there waiting for him in a silent show of respect. A middle-aged man stepped forward first. He extended his hand and shook Elias's hand firmly. "Mr. Grant," he said, "thank you for not letting this pass like the others. I have been wronged and kept silent for many years. Today, I saw what should have been seen long ago." Elias put his hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for speaking up. Change doesn't come from me. It comes from all of us." Another woman stepped forward. Her voice was hoarse with emotion. "I FaceTimed my daughter while you were talking. She asked me why you weren't angry. I told her, the strongest person is the one who can stay calm when they are hurt." Elias was silent for a second. The words, though he didn't show it, made his heart clench in a very real way. Lydia Carter walked slowly through the crowd, camera in hand. But this time she wasn't live streaming. "Mr. Grant," her voice was as light as the wind. Elias turned back. "Lydia, are you okay?" She smiled softly, her eyes still red. "Fine. But, you know, since I got off the plane I've had over 20,000 messages. People saying they've been discriminated against. People asking for a copy of your speech. People saying they feel hope." Elias nodded slowly, his eyes deep. "Hope always begins with a story told at the right time." Lydia pursed her lips. "If you need me to support any media project, I am available, not for views, but because I want to help spread the right thing." Elias looked at her for a long time. "Thank you, Lydia. We will need the voices of those who dare to look the truth in the face." Suddenly a figure appeared from behind the crowd, Captain Douglas Harris. He was no longer in his neat uniform. His shirt was wrinkled, his face was tired but determined. Elias stepped forward. Harris swallowed. Elias, I need to say this before anyone else. Elias was silent, waiting for him to speak. Harris took a deep breath. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not asking for your protection. I'm just saying, I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. If you want me in front of a camera, I'll do it. If you want me to train new staff, I'll do it. If you want me to face the community, I'll face it. His voice choked. I just don't want my son to grow up and look at me as someone who contributed to injustice. Elias looked him straight in the eye. No judgment, no doubt. Douglas, he said slowly, you have one chance to turn your mistake into a legacy. Use it. Harris closed his eyes for a second as if releasing a heavy burden. From a distance, Kelly Monroe approached. She stopped a few steps away from Elias, as if afraid to come any closer. Elias nodded slightly. Kelly continued walking. Mr. Grant, she said, I read hundreds of comments on the live stream. Many wanted me fired. Some said I didn't deserve forgiveness. Elias asked softly. And you, what do you think? Kelly trembled slightly. I think they're right. But I also think I want to be a better person. Not because I want to keep my job, but because I don't want my daughter to grow up and ask, what did I do when I was wrong? Elias smiled slightly, a sad but warm smile. Today she did what few people dare to do, face herself. Kelly wiped away tears. If you allow me, I would do anything to be better than yesterday. Elias put his hand on her shoulder. Kelly, it's a long journey, but I believe you have the courage to come with us. Just then, Michael Anderson's walkie-talkie rang. He immediately handed it to Elias. The board wants you at the meeting now. Elias took the radio but didn't speak into it right away. He looked at the passenger cabin, at the tarmac, at the waiting faces. Then he said, Jonathan, I'm coming. Call ended. Michael whispered Elias. You know what they want to hear, right? Elias nodded. I know. They want a plan. They want direction. They want the company to survive. Michael squeezed his hand. And you will give them all that. Elias looked into the distance. I will give them more than that. I will give them a reason to be proud. He turned back to everyone before leaving. Thank you all. Whatever happens from now on, I want you to know we did the right thing today. A man called out, Mr. Grant. What happens next? Elias turned his head, his eyes shining in the night lights of the airport. Next, we're going to change an industry, one flight at a time. That's not a slogan, that's a promise. He walked between the 2 rows of security guards, heading towards the conference room. His shadow stretched out under the lights, unwavering, unhesitating. And the entire airport held its breath because they knew the man was about to make a decision that could change EagleJet history. The temporary airport conference room had been hastily set up, but when Elias Grant walked in, the atmosphere inside felt more like a congressional hearing than an airline meeting. A large screen on the wall showed images of the 12 board members. Everyone was silent. There was only the sound of the air conditioner blowing softly. Elias stood across from them, not sitting down, because he knew this moment did not require comfort, it required clarity. Jonathan Reeves, chairman of the board, was the first to speak. Elias, what you said to the media just now has created a huge reaction. The FAA is asking for a presentation on the equity flight protocol. The press is calling, and the shareholders are divided. Elias nodded slightly. I can imagine. Now tell us, Jonathan continued, why we should go the way you suggest. Why should EagleJet be the first to break the industry norm? Elias didn't look at the screen. He looked at the empty space before him, where he imagined the future of millions of passengers. And he said, because this is not just an accident. Elias began, his voice slow but firm. This is a warning. The whole council fell silent. The airline industry is using old processes to deal with very new problems. Unconscious bias, judgments based on appearance, false beliefs about who looks like a first-class passenger. He took a deep breath. If we don't change, things like today will keep happening, not just to me, but to everyone. Elias took a step toward the screen. I do not propose a program of justice because I am a victim. I propose it because I have lived my whole life in the silence of those who have not been heard." Several council members bowed their heads. Elias continued, "We can wait for the next scandal. Or we can start today and be the first airline to get it right." Jonathan asked Elias, "Do you really believe this model will change the industry?" Elias replied, without hesitation, "I don't believe it. I know." A deep silence. Then Jonathan exhaled as if he had been waiting for those words all his life. "Then do it. No argument, no protest, just acceptance and trust." When Elias stepped outside, Seattle was dark. The wind carried a cool breeze from the ocean. The parking lot lights glowed in long yellow streaks. In the waiting area, he found Captain Douglas Harris, Kelly Monroe, and Lydia Carter waiting. No one said anything. They just looked at him with eyes that asked, "How will it turn out?" Elias stepped closer. "The board approved the new program," he said. "The equity flight protocol will be implemented system-wide." Kelly put her hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Harris stood up straighter like a man who had just been given the chance to rewrite the final chapter of his life. Lydia smiled through her tears. "I knew it. I knew you could do it." Elias put his hand on her shoulder. "Not me. We all can do it." The four of them walked out into the area outside the airport, where passengers, staff, and reporters were still gathered. But the strange thing was, no one shouted, no one pushed. They just made way for Elias to pass. An elderly woman held her grandson's hand and bowed as Elias passed. An airport cleaner smiled and waved at him. A white man nodded deeply as if to say, "I'm on your side." Elias sensed one thing clearly. Today they were not just accompanying him on the flight. They were embarking on a new journey with him. On the car ride back to the hotel, Elias sat by the window, watching the city of Seattle pass by like a quiet stream of memories. He remembered it all. The times he was looked at with suspicion. The times he had to prove his worth. The times he stayed silent because he thought his voice wasn't loud enough. And now he realized, sometimes God doesn't take away the storm. He gives us legs to stand in the storm. His phone rang. A message from his mother: "Son, I saw the news. Today you stood up for all those who didn't dare. I'm proud of you." Elias closed his eyes. The moment opened an old wound, but it was also a healing one. He replied, "I just do what I wish someone had done for me in the past." The car stopped in front of the hotel. Harris, Kelly, and Lydia got out with him. They stood together for a few seconds, none of them knowing what to say. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "Tomorrow we begin the real work. Today was just the prelude." Kelly nodded vigorously. "I'm ready, Mr. Grant." Elias smiled. "Kelly, call me Elias." Harris chuckled softly, the first time all day. "Very well, Elias. I will bring all the training records tomorrow. Be prepared." Elias patted him on the shoulder. "Good. We'll work as if the company's life depended on it." "Because it is," said Harris. Lydia looked at the trio, her eyes shining. "I will document this journey. Not to create drama, but to show people what real change looks like." Elias nodded. "Don't write my story. Write our story." As he entered the hotel lobby, Elias stopped in front of a large glass window. He saw his reflection, tired, tense, but strong in a very different way. Beside him, he saw the shadows of Harris, Kelly, Lydia, small but distinct. And Elias suddenly realized, change doesn't start with one person standing up. Change starts with many people standing together. He turned to them. "I want everyone to sleep well tonight. Because tomorrow, we are going to rewrite the way the airline industry treats its passengers. Not with slogans, but with actions." Harris laughed. "Sounds like a speech." Elias shook his head. "No, this is a promise." That night, as Elias sat alone in his room, the city lights reflected on the ceiling like scattered stars. He opened his laptop and wrote the first lines of his report to the FAA. "Change doesn't come from punishment. Change comes from seeing the real person behind the mistake." He paused for a beat, then continued, "We can create a fairer airline industry. Not perfect, but fair." He saved the document and looked up out the window. Seattle at night is quiet. No cameras, no reporters, no shouts. There was only open sky before him. And in that moment Elias whispered, "The journey begins." Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. If you found this story touching, making you think, or helping you see life from a different angle, please like the video, share with those who need it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Because who knows, you might be the one to make a difference for someone tomorrow.